Ladies and gents, welcome back to another Engineers podcast. Today I'm joined by Bob Van Lout, who is CEO and co founder of a company called Weaviate. Weaviate are an AI native vector database. So essentially, this is storing higher dimensional data and it's really more applicable for machine learning. I'm particularly looking forward to getting a little bit more into the podcast and talking more about the open source world. We've had a number of database businesses that have been on the podcast over the last couple of years. They're always interesting, they always spark a really good debate, they always generate very compelling conversation. So I'm looking forward to this one. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Bob's journey, Conway's law, and a couple more really interesting things. So, Bob, thanks for coming to join us. And you're the first person, by the way, structure wise, who said, I don't want a structure. Let's just have some freestyle notes. Let's just run with it. So I love that.
Yeah, it's first of all, thanks for having me. And it's like if I listen to podcasts myself, right? I always appreciate if people just have a conversation, right? And then it flows in a direction that might have, if it's of interest to us, then probably it's always of interest to people listening. And I prefer to do it just freestyle.
100%. I'm of the same belief. Don't worry about that. Before we get into Weaviate, and it'd be good to get almost like an elevator pitch on the business, it'd be really good to learn more about you, your background, and who you are, where you come from.
Yeah. So you did an excellent job in pronouncing my surname. So that's Dutch. So I'm from Holland. I am born and raised in the south, but I grew up in the middle of the Netherlands. But people, I assume they know it's tiny country. And I'm this I'm of this generation that almost grew up with the internet, right? So I was, I think, in the seventh or eighth grade when we got like the internet or an internet connection in our schools and at home, and I started to build stuff, and I did a lot of stuff online. Not only build stuff, but also explore, learn. Napster was very important, to discover like music and that kind of stuff, and so I also was interested in playing music. So when it was time for me to go to college, I actually studied music. Back then, I already had my first software company, which was very tiny. It was like a kind of a freelance business, but I just made money, making websites as most people start. And so I never thought about like building stuff like from an economic perspective, right? I just like to make stuff, and I so I studied music. I was able to do stuff online, make money out of that, which was great. And it was only when I got older, and older being, I would say, 25-ish, that I started to become very interested in the business around software. So I really started to focus on that. I changed what I was working on more to like that kind of software consultancy, and out of that, the idea for Weaviate was born. And I always wanted to have a product company, so this was the opportunity to start to build a product. So that is my background in a nutshell.
What particularly was drawing for the economic side of software for you?
It was not so much the economic side of software. It was more that I got interested in things such as brand building, value creation, capturing value, trying to model that, trying to get an understanding how we do that with software. So it was that's what I started to become interested in, right? So, and out of that came company building, right? So it was like there was like a that was the and then the economics of it play, of course, an important role because that's how we measure it. But it was more about, again, from this perspective, making stuff. business building, right, was something, brand building, product building was something that became of interest to me. And I don't know why that changed. I think just, you get older and you get your interest change over time, right? So and I became interested in that. And then Weaviate turned out to be an ideal, vehicle to you
Yeah,
know to do that.
love that. I think some people, innately have an entrepreneurship in them. But I do definitely think that you can create and develop and entrepreneurial flair and spark, like the more interested in products business become, you become more aware of what's out there. You can definitely create it and develop it. So it's nice to see that flourish. Now's probably a pretty opportune moment. Talk to us about Weaviate. Who are Weaviate?
Yeah. So Weavit is an started as an open source vector database. I mean, it still is an open source vector database. And the reason that vector databases emerged was that, and this is all before the AI boom, if you will, was that the machine learning models became more prominent again. Started around 2015. And if you deal with machine learning models, you deal with this data type called a vector embedding. And a vector embedding is ideal for search and recommendation systems. And if you deal with data, you deal with search, right? Because storing something is nice, but if you can't if you can't find it anymore, that's unfortunate, right? Every time you use an application and you try to find something in the search bar and you can't find it, it's a that's annoying, and that's what vector embedding solve, right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's actually a use case, right? And it goes way deeper. So you get recommendation systems, user behavior, those kind of things. The So that was quite a tiny niche. That niche grew and got into prominence because ML turned into AI. And a lot of people started to build with AI. And then if you want to work with these embeddings, then you want to store them somewhere. That's what the vector database does, right? Plus, that unique use cases started to emerge specifically for these vector databases. And that's kind of how that originated. And where we are now is that you ask yourself the question, okay, we're now starting to become like a serious company, right? Um, how do we differentiate ourselves, right? How do we position ourselves in such a market? Because for people who are listening, who might not be aware, it's like every time you have a touch point with like a digital system, we're now recording this with Zencaster, right? Every time you have such a touch point, there's a database involved, right? That stores stuff. It's everywhere all the time. Right? They even built in databases in your browser, right? So it's like it's everywhere. So that technology, how you position that, and how you talk to developers, how you go to market with that, that's what we do now, and that's a core focus now in the next phase of our company, which I find extremely exciting. It's like a lot of fun to do, and it goes back to what we said in the beginning, because it's building, it's making.
I was going to say that probably brings out your product building, brand building flair, which we'll touch on next couple of moments. You mentioned something really quite interesting early on in your piece around Weaviate. Talk to us about the specific use cases of Weaviate. And if you're an engineer listening, if you're a business listening, I want to try and understand, why would you use Weaviate as a solution right now?
Yeah. So there's kind of three evolutions already in what vector databases do, and all three are still being used. And so it's like it's not one over the other. It's like they're still like being used. And the first one is better search and recommendation systems. So the simplest example that I always give is like, if you take textual data, the only way in the past to retrieve that information from a database was by searching for keywords. So sometimes you think about an email, right? So you want to find this one email, you remember what it was about, but you forgot actually how you wrote it or what the keywords were in there, right? That's an ideal use case for vector search. So because what does it do? You have the query, goes through a machine learning model. The machine learning model outputs a vector embedding and makes a so-called similarity comparison between all the emails that you have and then this one query. And it's like, probably, I don't have an exact match on this, but this email is very similar to the question, right? And that was huge because search is everywhere, right? So that was like a first big step. Out of that, that was related to ChatGPT being launched, you got something called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. And the reason it's in the term actually, it's like we can ask something from the model, but it might not be the case that the model was trained on certain piece of information or just might not have access to it, right? Or something might have happened after training, so then it wasn't trained on that at all. So this concept, uh, so you augment the generation on retrieval time, so retrieval augmented generation turned out to be a very nice use case for a vector database because now you had a query that run through the database said like probably the answer sits in one of these, I don't know, 10 documents. That went into the generative model. And then when you create like chatbot or those kind of things, right? You had a so-called REC pipeline. That was the first unique use case for the vector database. And the first one is also like a unique one, but that was still better search and better. It was like not something new, and this REC was something new. Out of that, something else came, and that's what we call generative feedback loops. So, generative feedback loop is the that if you have that RAG pipeline, you can actually store that information back into the database. We have a nice example on Weaviate website with a blog post with Airbnb data, where you basically have a Weaviate that's full of incomplete or incorrect Airbnb data, and you basically ask the model, like, fix it. And so the model goes in, fixes the data, or as I always like to say, like, it's a way to turn chicken shit into chicken salad, right? For the first time, we were able to do that by having the database and the model, work in harmony together. But also where the name comes from, Weaviate comes from weaving the database and the models together. So that's the thing that's now hot and happening, right? So that's another new use case in the Vector database, and I expect that in the coming year we'll see maybe one or two more.
Wow. Okay. I can imagine that third use case in the rise of AI, especially over the last 20 months, give or take. Um, I can imagine the demand for using Weaviate as a solution has increased heavily.
Yes. So what you do is that uh, in open source you just have the numbers, right? So you look at the numbers and the download numbers, and it's super interesting how that works. But the in the early days, the downloads, you just want them to go up, right? And because then you know that there's adoption. And then when your company evolves, then open source and those numbers going up start to play a different role on how you use them in the company. But the answer is yes. So it's like those numbers though they keep going up. It could be the case that you sometimes you have like thousands of downloads in half an hour or something. And then in all fairness, that could also be a build pipeline or those kind of things. That doesn't mean that every individual download is like a different customer. That's not how it works. But as long as the trend is up, that's good when
That's
it
what
gets
you
adopted.
want.
Yep.
That's what you want. Let's go back to the early days. So, started as an open source project. Talk to us a little bit about the evolution then of Weaviate, and also something that I'm really keen to understand, and I've been asking people before when we've been discussing open source projects, is talk to us about that critical moment in the journey where you're building an open source product, that decision of what you keep private, and then the decision to actually turn this project into a business.
Yeah. So okay, let's tackle both questions, right? So the first one is the um If you build infrastructure, that's that takes a long time. First of all, to build the thing, then to get that into like a market fit position. And you don't have to do that open source, but open source is a way to build community and see how it's going, right? And that's a way of doing. You don't have to do it. You can also do it closed source, right? But then you need to walk a different path. And doing that open source comes a bit more naturally to me. It just makes more sense to me to do it that way. Then to your second question, so the big difference between doing something open source and closed source, especially when it's infrastructure, is or no, more in general, is that if you are closed, you have a relatively smaller user base. Even if they sign up for your free version, that's often uncomparable with open source equivalents, right? The upside is if you do it closed source, is that everybody who signs up, you have an email address, right? So you can reach out to these people. The problem is, or the challenge is that it's relatively small. Open source is the exact opposite. So you have a lot of that adoption, and then you need to figure out who are these people and how can we help them. So that's and the go-to-market mechanisms are different, right? So to do that, and that is super exciting because that's something that you can figure out, right? And that is the yeah, that's the magic in your go-to-market team, right? So the things you put in place to do that, and that's what we do now, right? Because one thing is that is important to know is that these technologies doesn't matter if it's vector database or something else. That's complex stuff, right? We're not talking about setting up a new iPhone, right? It's like it's core infrastructure. And one of the things is that we know is like if you help people early on and you help them to succeed, they're more likely to buy, right? And then the question is, what do they buy? Well, they actually don't pay you for the bits and the bytes. That's not the job to be done. The job to be done sits, among many other things, in the deployment options and in the tooling around. That's the job to be done. And that is where in the case of Weaviate, where we monetize. I am not a big fan of monetizing on the bits and bytes that are in open source. So it would be like an open core model or those kind of things. You can do that too, but I'm not per se a big fan of that. So, um, and that's the trick that you need to figure out. So, have a lot of downloads, a lot of users. Who are these people? What are they building? How can you help them? And then you can basically show them your little shop. And you can say, okay, hey, by the way, we have this stuff in our shop as well in case you need it, right? And that's the trick with how open source is different than closed source.
Interesting. Are you at that stage yet where you're looking to explore those options on how you actually monetize Weaviate, or are you still in build mode, almost building your shop window before you're
So
at that point?
yeah, so where we now is like we currently serve thousands of customers, right? But that was all inbound. So those were people coming to us and telling us like, we want to use the database, that kind of stuff. So the first million in revenue that we did was with zero go-to-market people, like zero, just by people signing up. And then to get to the enterprise deals and that kind of stuff, you need to the next phase. Where we are now at the companies now, we're now optimizing also the rest of that pipeline. So to find people, to identify them, and to help them, right? So, and that's what we're doing now. And I'm in a very luxurious position that I have an amazing team that's doing that. But also from a product perspective, right? So like the how you're differentiating there, how you're building there, right? So things that you're adding around the core database. If people would go to our website, they find on the homepage in the center, they see two concentric circles around the open source database, and it's the tooling that we offer around the core database to make it easier for developers to get to value of what they're building, right? So quicker to value, if you will, right? So you want enable developers to build ASAP and be successful ASAP.
100%. You spoke passionately about product building, business building. Talk to us about that experience. You've almost made that shift now from being an engineer. I'm sure you're still very founder led in the sense of you're still probably very hands on. But talk to us about product building and business building and what you've learned over these last few years.
Yeah, so actually, I am not that hands-on anymore. We're now at a stage that that's not. I don't. If you look at the people working on the core database team, I uh, I'm not even close in my coding skills to what these people are doing, right? Or if you look at the developer growth of the developer relations teams, what the content they're building in software, the quality what they're doing, I'm not even I couldn't even get close if I would write something myself. But I can answer your question because I'm guilty of something, and I don't know if guilty is the right word, but the when we started Weaviate, there was like this natural thing because you have to you have to start the company, and then you need to have a title, and you need to also have an official title, right? Especially when you register the company, and then the question, well, it was kind of natural that Bob is going to be the CEO, but we were like a three person company. So I'm guilty of Googling what does a startup CEO do? So because I wasn't sure what to do because I was just back then I was doing DevRel, documentation writing, website, and for example, my co-founder Chen was building the actual database, right? So and I was not very good at all of these kind of things, right? So but I had to do it, right? Because otherwise, who else would do it? So then when we decided to go down the VC path, so you raise some money and you can hire a couple of people. And then I learned that the first thing that you need to do is that all these things that you're doing, you need to hire people that are way better at you at these specific things and let them do that and run it, right? And then I learned, I said, okay, so now I have all these people doing great stuff. So then the question was, okay, so what do I do, right? And then I think the answer is different for everybody, but for me, so we're now, I think 80 people or something. And then I learned that for me, the answer was that I do only three things. One, I make sure that there's a clearly articulated vision, mission, and strategy. Two, I make sure that there's a company culture, right? That people enjoy to work at the company because if they enjoy working at the company, they can execute on that stuff. And the third thing is I need to make sure that we have enough money, right? And money comes through revenue, money comes through in the early stages when you're building to if you decide to not bootstrap the VC path, right? Those three things I do, and everything else is in way with people who are way more capable of doing all these individual things um, uh, um, than I am. So that's what on a daily basis I just do one or more of these three things, right? So and if I now think back, it's like I think actually even from day one, I could already have said like, okay, those are the three things I need to do. It's just because we don't have the people yet. I need to do a lot of stuff myself, right? Which is fine. That's just part of it. But then if stuff grows, then you can sort of hire people and they take that stuff out of your hands, and that's where we are right now.
Yeah. I think that evolution as well of startup founder, you've gone from being really scrappy, doing the jobs that you need to do, raising money, capital, always really important, still a really important role in your day to day right now, but hiring the right people to take you away from the scrappy stuff, obviously polish it, um, but to get you down being really lean, doing the right things at your level for the business makes complete sense.
Exactly, and and I even would like to go as far. So I recently was at an event with other founders, and there was a dinner, and they had like this little game with these cards on the table. And that when we were waiting for the courses, we were somebody read these cards, and then we did get it. And one of the questions was um, what does an ideal day? What do you do on an ideal day in your role, right? So we have all these CEO founders, and I was surprised that, like, so we were going around the table, and somebody said, "Oh, I would spend the whole day with the product team. I'd only," or somebody said, "Oh, I would be the whole day with like the sales team," and my answer was, and I didn't. It was not my intention to be contrarian, but my answer is like doing absolutely nothing. And what I
I was
meant
going to
with
say, like, no firefighting probably would have been
it,
mine.
exactly,
Exactly.
exactly. So and people looked at me. They were like, "What?" I said, "Well," I said, let me give you an analogy. I said, "I see these three things that I just mentioned. There's like it's like plate spinning, right? So you spin the first plate, vision, mission, strategy. You spin the second plate, the culture. Third plate, financials, right? If one starts wobbling, you have to quickly go back and just spin it again, that it just spins again. If one falls off, you have like a serious problem, right? But if they're spinning and you can sit back and relax and go like, hey, they're spinning, you know that gravity will do its work at some point in time. So then you have to spin them again. But the better you get at spinning them, the longer they spin on their own. And and unfortunately, I'm not yet in a situation that I can do absolutely nothing. But but I see that as a sign of then I need to get better at properly spinning them, right? So I agree also with what you said. Like, success is that you can take a step back, observe the company, and go like, I like what I see.
Good. I think that's important. One CEO that I was listening to a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, and their answer was decisions. Like, I only want to spend time on making decisions in a day, whether it's one decision or two decisions. That's probably my capacity. That's my role, to make decisions, tough decisions. So I probably think simplicity at that level of, obviously you have to steer the business in the right direction, mission, strategy, etc. But decisions, or no firefighting, in your case, probably are the right things to do at your level, or
Yeah,
ideal things to do.
yeah, it's a form of minimalism, right? So it's like if if there's uh, a conflict, right, or if there's like a little fire burning somewhere, it's I'm it's almost always one of these three things, right, that you can point to, and it's like, and I even like to go as far as that sometimes there might also be something that has like a little bit of a canary in the coal mine effect, right? That you go like, this seems like a small. I smell a little bit of smoke, but if I don't fix that now, then it will turn into like a huge fire, right? So it's like and that is what you're doing. So you're, or in how I've decided to fill in this role is to constantly be on the outlook over the three axes of
Yeah,
that I just mentioned.
good. Um, Conway's Law is something that you're passionate about. I would love to explore it. First and foremost, what is Conway's Law, and how is it maybe applied across Weaviate? I'd love to explore that and go into a bit more detail.
Yeah, I'm not per se passionate about Conway's Law, but Conway's Law is an example of the thing that I'm passionate about. And so the thing that I'm interested in is communication, right? And in the broad sense of the word, and language, and how we use that uh, uh, to to build software, to build companies around it, and that kind of stuff. And what Conway's law says, and this is a little bit of a free interpretation, how I've kind of changed it over the course of the over time, is that originally it says that you can see the communication structures of an organization in the software that's being created. The more free form how I use it is that software evolves based on how you communicate about it, right? And that goes as deep as like a function level, right? So it's like so for example, um, we just released like a tenant offloading, right? So then this concept comes up like, okay, we want to be able to offload tenants to S3 buckets and that kind of stuff. So that's how that starts. And then if you go into the actual software, you see that the language used to build that uses the same language, right? Um, that's what Conway's law says. So that also means that if you have complex, if you haven't figured out your communication, or if you have complex communication or complex org structures, then that inevitably will end up in your software, right? So you can't. It's like a law. It's like a thing that happens, right? That's also why software projects. There's like there's a famous book. It's called the Mythical Man Month, right? And what the Mythical Man Month basically says is that the more people you throw at a software problem, the longer it takes to finalize the software project. So it's not like so it's like and the example also, and that has to do with communication lines. And there's like this little joke that comes out of it that it says like if somebody is pregnant, it takes 9 months to deliver a baby. It's not that if you have 9 people being pregnant that you have a baby in 1 month, right? So it's like uh, that has to do with the communication lines. So if the two of us are working on a software, so if I would start a software project alone, I don't have to communicate. I just have it in my head and I'm working on it, and I go like, oh, this is like too much work. It's like, hey, I might reach out to you and say, hey, Elliot, can you help me with this project? And you go like, great, but now we need to communicate, right? And if you had a third person, then we just doubled the communication lines, and so that goes up like exponentially, right? So the number of communication lines. So that is what Conway's law says, and I find that fascinating because if you create open source technology, you're dealing with a community, and you communicate with the community, and the community communicates back, and so that inevitably ends up in the software, and I find that fascinating.
What are some really valuable principles that you think you can apply to communicating to ensure simplistic software? As an example, if there is one person, Bob, maybe communicating to 5 people on let's build software, what are principles, processes to ensure a simplistic piece of software being built?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it should be simplistic. It can be it's fine if it's complex, right? Because that's sometimes just the case that it's complex. A risk, which is it's an inevitable risk in software development, is that you're not user centric in how you think about something, but that you are company centric in how you think about it. Or before it's a company, that you're project centric. So, for example, that might mean that if you define an API, for example, and you use language in the definition of the API from a company perspective, that does not guarantee that the user understands what you mean in the definition of that API. But if you make it user centric, then you take the perspective of the user, which is a form of that's actually a form of empathy, right? So it's like a form of like taking the other's point of view and then look inwards and then build from that angle. And that is extremely hard to do. And the reason why it's extremely hard to do is that there's like this joke in the world of databases It takes a weekend to define the API. It takes you a month to develop the first prototype, and then 10 years of actually delivering the product. That's like in the world of databases, a little joke because databases are hard. And a thing that we tend to do, we being the industry, is that we define these APIs. And we're like, oh, great, very user centric because we start with the API and we'll work our way in. But we might hit a roadblock in year two, right? Like, oh boy, if only new, or there might be a new innovation that we want to adopt. Oh boy, that's it. And then you might push that change back from the inside out to the user. And now all of a sudden the user is confused, right? And that has to do with communication, and it has to do with always taking the user's point of view, and that is extremely difficult to do because the more you know about your own technology, the harder it is to take the outsider's perspective in what you're presenting. If you have a team and you have been working for months on something into the nitty gritty detail, it's very hard to take that step back, take the outsider perspective. It's like, how do we actually present this to this user? And so that would be my the first answer, I guess, to your question would be making that extremely user centric. The second part of the question is like, I am I am not convinced that in this case less is more in the case of technology, because compare it with the Apple mouse, right? So back in it with the Windows mouse with two buttons, and then Apple came out and we should have one button. And the argument was like, that's a design principle, just one click, one mouse, and two is too much, right? So, okay, maybe. However, a lot of people were used to and wanted to use the right mouse button, right? So now Apple introduced I'm an Apple user. What do I use? I use Control. Yes, I need to press the Control key, or I need to use two fingers, right, to do that. So you could argue, well, was that actually an easier UX that I now had to figure out that I need to push the control button, or would it have just have been handy if I just had a right, mouse button? Ironically, Apple mouses today, they look like they're one mouse button, but actually two and three. Actually, there's a scroll option in the middle. So um, developers are smart. They're smart, right? They're building an application, they're putting in the work, right? I believe the psychological term is like effort justification. But you just should make sure that they don't run into a blocker. But it's perfectly fine. It's okay, these are the options that you have. This is how you do one. This is how you do two. So it's more that you guide them in the journey, but that they need to do some work to get there is fine because that's their job. They like to do that. It's nice that you had to do something to make it work. That's a that even might be more gratifying in using it. So that's the second thing that I would think about is the developer experience is extremely important, but developer experience does not mean per se less or lesser, right? Because if you unpack developer experience and you go all the way, like way back, like way back, I have this the Zen of Assembly book from Mike Ebrish, where he basically says like they ship these Intel CPUs without documentation. You just have to figure it out, whatever it was. So that is where that comes from, right? But it now sometimes interpreted as just doing less, and it's not per se less.
Okay, two interesting perspectives. And I think what I derive from both those, user experience, developer experience, I'm seeing a much closer relationship nowadays between engineering and design. Probably goes back to your user experience point, and I've got a couple of really interesting podcasts coming up on this, well, we're going to explore it even further. But starting at that end point of user experience, what does the person want? How do they think? Even to your Apple reference, how are they clicking their buttons? How are they finding things on their keyboards? Like, these are really important, useful, principled things to really think about. And your second point, developer experience, is something that you and I wanted to touch on today. DevX has really come to rise in the last couple of years. I think people have probably been doing it, in fairness, for a lot longer than it's coined the phrase. But give us a bit of an intro on developer experience, how you think about it inside of Weaviate, even some principles you might apply, and generally just package up um, developer experience for us.
Yeah, so I think so. First of all, I think there's a this guy John Maeda. He every year at South by Southwest he presents something called the Design in Tech report, where he talks about three types of design: classical design, computational design, and design thinking. So if you really want to go into this, I can highly recommend people just to look that stuff up. But what is interesting is that there was a time in software where we didn't apply design methodology in how people used something, right? So I try to come up with with a metaphor and an analogy. Um, um, it's like if you build a very fast car or something, like it doesn't matter if it's nice to sit in the car, right? So that doesn't matter. It just so take for example from Formula One car, right? It's like not nice to sit in a Formula One. You need to take the steering wheel out before you can get out of the car and that kind of stuff, right? It's like, but that's not the point of the car, because it's like it just needs to be fast and it's just aerodynamic, God knows whatever. And the assumption was for a long time uh, that that's what people wanted. Turned out that actually that's not true. That people kind of got annoyed banging their head against the wall, not knowing how to do something, or getting stuck somewhere, or not getting the appropriate help to do something. And then something shifted in the infrastructure industry that people didn't foresee. And it turned out that developers in the bell curve of the developers, right? So in the middle started to gravitate toward things that were easier to use rather than that they were subjectively quote unquote better and sorry, objectively better. And so they made more a subjective choice than an objective choice. Like it's like, okay, I just get how this. A great example in programming languages is Python. Python is now being used a lot, right? We see that in Weaviate, most used client language, right? Because it's so easy to use. I now do that too. If I want to write something or I want to have a business report, I write it in Python. Whereas we actually know that if you have a compiled language and that kind of stuff, it's faster or that kind of stuff. So the that was and that was why that focus on developer experience started to happen, because also back in the day, selling software was more like a top-down thing. If your boss told you you're gonna use that database, they were like, okay. And so there was no incentive for the company to just have a great developer experience because the money was already in, right? But that changed with that bottom up approach where actually the developer said like, I want to use that tool. I think that tool is the best for what we're solving. And now all of a sudden you need to give him a great experience, because if you gave him a excuse my French, shitty experience, they're gonna go like, yeah, I don't want to use this because I don't know how it works. So it's basically the money, receiving the money shifted from before the experience to after the experience, right? And that's why that became important. And but again, it's very important that the experience means how does somebody feel when they're using it, right? That does not mean the shortest path to getting somewhere or the most minimalistic path to get somewhere. There's even, if I may add one thing there, it's there's a famous psychological research paper called like the peak end rule, where you basically say that people don't judge their experience based on the average experience, but on the peak experience and the end of the experience. And you can build that into your software as well.
Interesting to see that there's both physical and psychological aspects to developer experience in the literal sense, but also how you feel at your best moment using that X and at your worst moment using that X. Interesting. Really, really interesting stuff. Um, I think before we wrap up, it would be really good to understand next 12 months, Weaviate. What are some of your plans that you can share with us? Where will you be growing? How can people join the business? This is almost an opportunity for a humble brag, come and join us moment if the business is growing in certain areas.
Yeah. So yes, we're hiring. So it's like a we are a remote first company. So of course there are certain roles that we need in certain areas, right? So think about like sales and developer relations, but engineering roles, etc. We hire globally. You can just find it on careers.weaviate.io, and so just we people can reach out. We have a lot of open roles right now, and I think the other part of your question is the we're now really working on growing out of the pure database into more the the tooling to enable people to build AI native applications end to end, with the partnerships, with the integrations, with something we call the workbench. So that's why we're hiring people to help us to build that and achieve that. But that's the coming 12 months, really turning from that. Of course, we're already on the path, right? But really doubling down on just from that open source project to like a really strong open source business. So if you want to join that transition, then I can tell you it's very exciting. It's very cool.
I love your energy. I said that before. I love your energy. I'm glad you're here talking to us about where the business has started, growing that flair, that spark, that enjoyment for building a business. It's incredible to see what you've built so far. Raising money, taking the business to 80 people, building a community, and then transitioning from open source business to where you're moving in the AI space. So honestly, Bob, really well done. And
Thank you, Elliot.
it, pleasure. It's been a joy having you here today. So I want to say a massive thanks from me at Engineers, no doubt from people listening, and for people listening, all of your likes, shares, subscribership, messages to friends is massively, massively appreciated. So keep doing that. That's what keeps us ticking. That's what keeps us going. So please do that. And Bob, again, thanks for coming to join us. All the success at Weaviate, and it's bye for now from us.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this episode. Massively appreciate you listening and checking in with us. If you want to find out more about us and what we're doing, please check us out on social media. What we're trying to do at Engineers is build a community to drive knowledge sharing and experiences. On Twitter, we can be found Engineers.io. It's no underscore. We've also got a website which is engineers.io. These links will all be posted in the description. Any feedback and comments are massively appreciated. We're always looking to improve on where we can. Thanks, guys.